There we go. All right, now we are live on YouTube. So hello to everyone on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for watching in whatever format you're watching. People will keep coming in the next couple minutes, but I'll go ahead and get started and everyone can settle in. But hi, hello, welcome. If you're on the East Coast like me, I hope you're staying warm because it is frigid and snowy out there. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Director of Events for Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I'm so glad to see everyone watching tonight for this virtual event. Before we begin, I want to first thank the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for partnering with us on this event. They work tirelessly to help find missing children, reduce child sexual exploitation, and prevent child victimization. In a little bit, I'm going to put a link in the chat so you can learn more about this amazing organization. Plus, you can find out how you can support them by donating, volunteering, or attending one of their many events that they do both in person and virtually. I also have just a couple technical details to go over. First, I will drop a link a couple times in the chat where you can get your copy of Maggy Krell's book, Taking Down Backpage, straight from Politics and Prose. Several of you already ordered on Eventbrite when you registered, which is amazing, but we do have tons of signed book plates that Maggy sent straight to P&P. So if you order a book, you will get a signature with it. You can select shipping, and we ship to anywhere in the United States, or if you live in the DC area and you can get your car out of the snow, you can pick up your book at any of our 3 store locations that are all around the district. Also, if you have a question for the author, please submit it in the Q&A space, and we will get to those in just a little bit. You can submit your question at any point between now and the end of the event. Okay, now on to the good stuff. Maggy Krell is a legal trailblazer who has taken on impactful cases as a criminal prosecutor and human rights lawyer. Her most notable accomplishments stem from her tireless efforts to combat human trafficking and protect and empower survivors, including her groundbreaking prosecution of the sex trafficking website Backpage. This book is a gripping story of tragedy, overcoming adversity, and the pursuit of justice that gives insight into the fight against sex trafficking in this digital age. Moderating the conversation is Yiota Souras, Senior Vice President General Counsel for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. As General Counsel, she manages and provides legal guidance on all legal matters relating to NCMEC's unique nonprofit mission to help find missing children, reduce child sexual exploitation, and prevent child victimization. She also oversees legislative and policy-related matters for the organization. So now, without further ado, everyone, please welcome these 2 speakers onto your screen. And guys, the floor is yours.
Great. Brittany, thank you so much. And thank you also to Politics and Prose for hosting the event tonight. Maggy, you and I have been discussing how to combat online sex trafficking for at least the past 6 or 7 years. And it's such a privilege for me to be here tonight to discuss your new book, Taking Down Backpage. For those of you in the audience who have not had a chance to read the book yet, and I hope all of you do, Maggy's written a really captivating story that I would describe as part legal thriller, part advocate testimonial, and part eye-opening account of how much more we all need to do to protect children and vulnerable adults from sex trafficking online. So Maggy, let's just jump right in. Let's start with Backpage. What exactly is the website, or was the website, backpage.com?
Thanks so much, Yiota, and thanks so much again to Brittany and Politics and Prose for hosting this event tonight. So Backpage was a website that operated for about a decade, and it was the #1 hub for commercial sex, including sex trafficking and the sex trafficking of children. At its peak, it operated in more than 800 cities throughout the world, and it was a multi-million-dollar operation.
Now, the term sex trafficking is used a lot in the media these days. Can you explain for us exactly what sex trafficking is?
Sure. So sex trafficking is a federal crime, and it also has state statutes that also criminalize sex trafficking. But essentially, it is a commercial sex act. So some sexual act that's done in exchange for either money or something else of value, but with the added element of force, fraud, or coercion. Or in the case of minors, so anyone under 18, it's any commercial sex act.
And what are some common misconceptions that you think people have about sex trafficking when they see a movie or read about it in a media story?
Great question, Yiota. There's a lot of misconceptions, and I think the problem with that is it can be really distracting if we don't talk about what sex trafficking really is and what it really looks like. We can be distracted, and it can kind of hinder our progress in moving forward to really attack what the problem is. Some of the stuff we've seen in movies like Taken involving kidnapping, overseas kidnapping, people chained in boxes, all kinds of stuff like that. That's either sensationalized or focused on things that happen in other countries. Now, all of that is possible, and there's certainly sex trafficking is a worldwide problem, but people need to know that it happens right here in the United States, and that the victims aren't just foreign born, that traffickers don't care where their victims are from, that oftentimes in the disproportionate amount of sex trafficking victims here in the United States are kids, women and kids born right here in the United States and born, frequently into poverty. We see a lot of vulnerable youth, runaway kids. There's a disproportionate number of Black and brown girls that are trafficked. And so, until we start really being honest about who this impacts, I think we're going to be hindered in addressing it.
I'm glad you really discussed some of the misconceptions, especially around who is most victimized by sex trafficking. Some of the movies and other pieces that you mentioned often characterize victims of trafficking as a young white girl. And I think certainly at NCMEC and certainly in your experience, we know that, quite often the background of children who are victimized is much more diverse. Is there something else that you could explain to the audience around some of the different types of children who might be at risk and victimized by sex trafficking?
Sure. It's a good point. The media really tends to focus on white victims, in sex trafficking, frankly, in all crimes. And yes, there certainly are white victims of sex trafficking. I think of some in my head right now. But there is a disproportionate amount, especially of Black girls, that are forced into the commercial sex trade. We're seeing a lot of multi-generational trauma. So that's, kids that have family members who are already in the sex trade. We're seeing a lot of kids that are from impoverished homes. And why that's a vulnerability factor is that a lot of times, kids in these homes don't necessarily have a stable network at home. They don't necessarily have a parent home, and they have unmet needs such as, basic things, food, clothing, a place to stay. Or they have unmet emotional needs. They're looking for attention and affection and compliments. And so what we see is a predator who will prey on those particular vulnerable needs. So just something simple, on Instagram, liking a post, making comments, giving someone compliments, and then offering up those other unmet needs, offering a ride, offering a meal, offering to take someone shopping. And that's the manipulation. So when I talked about the definition of sex trafficking, I think the first people is like the kidnapping and the force, but most of the cases really start with that manipulation and that coercion. And it results in this lopsided power dynamic where the victim kind of thinks that they're in a relationship with someone who's paying attention to them and offering something that they haven't had before. And then it really shifts into sex trafficking.
And are girls the only ones who are victimized by sex trafficking?
No, the majority of the victims are girls, but there's certainly been cases where boys have been trafficked as well. And I should flag too that failures in the child welfare system often have exacerbated this. We've seen a disproportionate amount of foster youth who have been victims of sex trafficking, kids who are otherwise impacted by the juvenile justice system tend to be impacted here. Kids that are running away from unsafe homes, LGBTQ youth. So all these other vulnerability factors really have, combined to make some kids just more susceptible to this. But, I also think it's really important to recognize that it can, in fact, happen to anyone. That, I wouldn't say that any community is really immune to it, but those are the factors that we've seen.
Now, you certainly worked on sex trafficking long before you tackled Backpage.com. Do you recall what your first case was where you prosecuted a case involving sex trafficking?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to sort of put this whole thing in perspective. When I started as a prosecutor, we didn't have a sex trafficking charge yet in California. The federal Trafficking Victim Protection Act didn't pass. The very first generation of it didn't pass until the year 2000. It's been amended multiple times since then. In California, I think it was first codified in 2006. So I would say, you know, when I first became a prosecutor, my first sex trafficking case wasn't a sex trafficking case. It was a prostitution case, because that's how that was the legal landscape at the time. And so I think, you know, what's important as I look back, you know, with you, Yiota, because I know you've been working on these issues for a long time too, is just, you know, how far the legal landscape has come in the last 20 years where we recognize these cases for what they are.
And as Maggie, that was really helpful, especially for the audience, I think, to learn that, you know, not all that long ago, there really were not federal sex trafficking crimes and even state sex trafficking crimes. As you progress in being able to take advantage of some of these new laws around sex trafficking, at what point did you decide that you were going to put your energy as a prosecutor behind going after Backpage?
Well, at that point, you know, every single case that every prosecutor had went through Backpage. I mean, it was really kind of the ubiquitous common denominator in all of our cases. And my goal was to really address the problem systematically. I didn't want to do any more street level busts where, you know, we were, you know, at best, you know, arresting buyers, maybe a couple of pimps. At worst, some of the victims were actually getting ensnared in the criminal justice system with their own cases. I really wanted to do something to break down this system that seemed to be just seamlessly wrapping in vulnerable victims and selling them again and again with the ruthless efficiency of the internet. I had prosecuted a motel that was a neighborhood hub for sex trafficking, and that kind of broke down, you know, a significant network. I had also gone after a ring of brothels that were rotating victims from, you know, location to location. Some of them were based in illicit massage establishments, some of them were residential. But, you know, taking out those cases was significant because it was systematic. It was basically disrupting a pipeline. Backpage was the biggest pipeline that I could ever imagine. And I definitely, you know, set eyes on disrupting it, knowing that it would be challenging, but also thinking that it could really be a game changer.
And in the end, you were the first prosecutor that actually brought a criminal case against Backpage. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think most of us in the audience would find it really hard to understand how a website like Backpage could even exist. A website where somebody could go look for a child in their area that they could purchase for sex or for sexual abuse, rape. Could you explain a little bit about how a website like that was even legally permitted to be online?
Well, I get asked that a lot, and I still find it as mind-boggling right now as I did, you know, the first time I was asked it. I mean, I think it's, you know, completely outrageous that, you know, that would be allowed, that would be tolerated. But what I found is the Communications Decency Act, you know, was a really significant shield for Backpage, and it continues to be a shield for websites.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's go into a little bit about what the Communications Decency Act is. It's always going to be a subject of discussion when we're talking about crime online and how you can hold a website responsible. So could you explain just exactly what it is and how that had been a barrier against seeking liability for websites like Backpage?
Sure. So the Communications Decency Act was first passed in 1996. And again, to put that into historical perspective, that's, you know, 4 years before the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed. In fact, significantly, in, you know, 1995 is when we really first started talking about human trafficking because of brave survivors who actually escaped from Thai survivors who were stuck, essentially enslaved at garment factories in the Los Angeles area, who escaped, and that is kind of credited as starting the modern, you know, anti-human trafficking movement. But, you know, as they are making their escape, Congress is debating the Communications Decency Act, which protects online platforms from being held accountable for content posted by third parties. So essentially, you know, the platform like Facebook, for example, just acts as a blank whiteboard, whereas a third party can do whatever they want on that whiteboard, and Facebook or the company would say they couldn't be held accountable because of this law. Now, the Communications Decency Act kind of had dual intent at the time. First, it was to protect the free exchange of ideas on the internet, and second, it was to allow for some moderation so that companies could take action, in child pornography cases. But I would say that nobody ever envisioned the internet would burst on the scene and would grow and expand and become as efficient as it has.
Now, I think it's fair to say, based on your explanation of the Communications Decency Act, that it was certainly a complication as you started to put your case together. What were some of the other obstacles that you faced in putting together, again, such a novel case against such a very large and established website?
Yeah, so the Communications Decency Act was the main barrier that we faced. We knew that would be their defense. It had been successfully invoked by other websites, and it had been successfully invoked by Backpage against civil lawsuits. We thought that having a criminal case was different. We thought that our charges were unique. We felt like we had a really solid theory, and we were continuing to gather evidence. So there are several challenges. First of all, we're a California office going after a worldwide company that wasn't based in California. It's also, it can be really challenging to find, victims and survivors who are willing to cooperate in these kinds of cases. That's really, really challenging on them. It's, not always something that they want to do, as much as we think that, standing up to your abuser is a powerful thing. And certainly sometimes it can, some victims want nothing to do with it. So there were those challenges as well. It was also just such a huge case. So much evidence, so many questions to answer, so many rocks to overturn. So I knew I was going to be in for, a really big fight.
So in addition to just the mere scope of a case like that, and the fact that targeting Backpage for criminal charges was literally uncharted territory at that point for any prosecutor in the US, was there a point as you were putting the case together that you realized that this case would really, in many ways, define your career as a prosecutor up to that point?
I didn't really think of that. I thought, I knew I was going against the legal grain. I knew that, but to me, there was no question that this was the right thing to do. I was a human trafficking prosecutor. This was the biggest thing happening in human trafficking. I felt like I had a way to stop it, and I couldn't do anything else. I also think all the time just about the courage that survivors had. The way that survivors have told me over the years about what they escaped and the barriers they faced. So for me, part of this was helping them carry that burden.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the day the case was filed. So at some point, I think early October 2016, the case was filed, and the corporate executives of Backpage were in the process of being arrested pursuant to that case. Can you take us through a few of your memories of that day? I can imagine it was probably many days that blurred together, given all the work that you had to do. But what are some of your really pivotal memories of that day?
Sure. So, I should, just to give a little context to that, by the time we actually arrested these defendants, I had been working on this case solid for probably 3 years. I'd already, I'd been, planning this case, and I'd been focused on this almost exclusively for a long time, although I had, a pretty busy caseload with other cases as well. This was my number one. It really had my attention. And it was a day, that I thought might never come. Getting an arrest warrant signed, was a really big deal. So I went to Texas for the bus. It turned out that the Backpage's headquarters were in Dallas, and the plan was to arrest the CEO, Carl, as he was getting off an airplane from the Netherlands to Houston, Texas. So I was with, 2 investigators from my office in California. We flew out to Dallas. We met with a team from the Texas AG's office. We were working with them, and that was great. They were really, really helpful. And I was, we were so lucky to have them on board working with us on this thing. So we, the team was briefed, we planned out what we were going to do. I was going to be staged by the Dallas office. The plan was for us to go in and execute the search warrant. But first we needed to arrest Carl Ferrer, the CEO. So my colleague, who's the lead investigator, Brian Fickner, went to Houston, and he was essentially waiting in the airport for this plane to land. And I swear it was the longest flight of my life that was never on. I mean, we were just waiting. We were texting each other. We were playing Words with Friends. We were, just waiting. And then finally it happened. Finally, the flight landed. Carl Ferrer was one of the first few people to get off the airplane, and he was put in handcuffs and arrested. All the Texas agents, went into the office and started the search. I went into the office a couple of minutes after that. But it was pretty unreal. I mean, we had just pulled off this arrest of the CEO of, the biggest human trafficking ring in the history of the world at that point. It was a really, really big deal. I remember calling you, so I'm curious what your reaction was and what kind of feedback you were getting on your end.
Sure. No, I remember that day also, not of course in as much detail as you, but, definitely remember that call, and, knew that, a lot of prosecutors have been looking at this issue, and that you've been looking especially closely at it, and just kind of how monumental, when you told me that Carl Ferrer had been arrested, that the case had been filed, the criminal charges were moving. I think you told me you were in Dallas at that point, kind of waiting to go into the building. And, initially just, it seemed like such a culmination of, so much legal analysis. I mean, deliberative around the Communications Decency Act and many other issues, as you've already explained. And, certainly the culmination of a tremendous amount of work that you did. And I remember there were at that time a lot of private attorneys who were working with survivors and their families who had filed private lawsuits against Backpage or contemplating it. And so there were a lot of rounds of discussions with them once it became public about the implication, criminal prosecution would have now. A lot of discussions with staff on the Hill who had been very invested in looking at solutions. And, then though, as the day went on, and I think as the news became more public and, both about the arrest and about the criminal charges, I definitely remember getting calls from survivors, and especially from some moms of survivors that we've been working with at NCMEC and who were involved in some of the various lawsuits. And I don't know if vindication is the right word, but I remember the tone in their voice and the feeling that they had been heard and seen in a very different way. It was the first time that the U.S. criminal justice system had really stood up for them in a major, major decisive way. And I remember by the end of the day, of course, it was a fascinating case legally and all of that, but I remember thinking that the reaction of those families and those survivors, that was the legacy of that day. And Maggie, that was the legacy of your work, that really started in a lot of ways that day as well. That's really what I remember. A lot of things going on that day for sure.
There's a lot going on. We had a lot of balls in there.
Yes.
Get myself from Dallas to Houston then very quickly, because the first thing that happened once we arrested Carl Ferrer was that he was trying to make bail, and we thought he was going to be held for this extradition hearing that was going to happen the next week. But suddenly everyone started freaking out that he was going to get out right away, and then he was going to leave, and then the case was going to be off track, and it was pretty nuts. So I remember then getting myself to Houston and going to court, and we were able to work out a deal to bring him back to California.
So let's talk a little bit, you get past those first few days, tremendous activity, like you said, on the ground, a lot of different teams doing a lot of different work. But now you're in court. And so you're back in Sacramento, your case is proceeding, and your initial criminal complaint ran into a few problems in court due to the Communications Decency Act that we've been discussing, and is such a big theme around these cases. Can you give a little background as to what happened initially with that complaint?
Yeah, so we really thought we put together a compelling argument to get around the Communications Decency Act. I plan to show that the defendants were assisting in creating content in whole or in part, which would take them out of the Communications Decency Act. I plan to argue that because they were criminal charges and not civil charges, they shouldn't be eligible for the Communications Decency Act defense. I could go through all the arguments that I lost, but I'll just summarize it by saying that none of these arguments compelled the court. It wasn't just a little barrier. I hit a major roadblock. My case got dismissed within just weeks of that, exciting day where I filed it. A month later, all that felt like it was for nothing. My whole case got dismissed. Our whole case got dismissed, and I was back to square one. And it was really, really disappointing. I knew that I mostly just felt awful for all the people who were excited about the case, who believed in the case, all the survivors that came forward to support the case, that it was just such a letdown for everyone.
Now, as disappointing as that was, it was a very brief moment in time because you came back very, very quickly and filed a new case against Backpage and against, again, the Backpage principles. How was that second case different from the first case?
That's right. So, we were able to regroup. We had been collecting financial records from the Backpage defendants. We had done search warrants for the financial institutions that they were dealing with at the same time as the arrest. So we were looking at that. We're finally able to look at that data. And based on that, I was able to refile. And this time we're filing money laundering charges, which really took the defendants outside of the Communications Decency Act, because I wasn't relying anymore on the ads themselves.
Now, on the second case, Backpage tried to get those charges thrown out as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but this time there was a very different outcome.
That's right. Yeah, this time, so we're giving away the whole book now, right? So this next time, but it's better in the book, I promise. So this time, we went back to court, and it was a different story. The money laundering charges, the court ultimately ruled were allowed to move forward. Now, it felt like a very close ruling. I mean, we went through months of briefing on these issues. There was a lot of different arguments that we had to tease out. This case was pending for a long time before the court ultimately ruled in our favor that we could move forward.
So now you're really in it. Right now, you're past the motion to dismiss. You can really begin your case. Do you remember the hearing where the court ruled that he was going to allow those claims to proceed, and you knew that you really had a live case now?
Yeah.
How did that feel for you and your team? You've had a lot of highs and lows over really just a period of a couple of months. How did it feel in court that day?
I mean, I was so relieved. I was so happy, and I was so relieved that we were able to move forward. I mean, it was almost like I felt like I was crazy going out on a limb with this case, and I'd already lost once, and I was now doing it again. And even my own coworkers were like, "Are you going to let this go?" No. So there I was in court, and we got this ruling, and it was such a great ruling, and I was just thrilled. Now, as prosecutors, we're trained to be robots in court, so I probably looked exactly how I looked when I lost a couple months before. But once I got a couple blocks away from the courthouse, I think I managed to smile.
I hope you managed a bit more than a smile at that point. Maybe a little celebration that night.
Maybe a couple drinks.
Maybe. So I think the audience would be interested to know, what is the status of the website backpage.com today? Okay, so
fast forwarding a little bit, ultimately what happened is the website was shut down. It was seized by a joint operation with our office, the California Attorney General's office, the Texas Attorney General's office, and the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for Arizona. Carl Ferrer, that CEO that we had arrested back in 2016 in Houston, pled guilty to multiple charges in California and Texas and in the federal case. That all happened in the spring of 2018. as of today, this story is not over yet. Charges are still pending against the other two co-owners and then a handful of other Backpage employees and principals. But the website has been shuttered since 2018. I should add to that over $200 million was seized.
Just a tremendous result. I don't think people really, who aren't in this field or who weren't familiar with Backpage really could have conceptualized that there would be that much money that would be seized off of the sort of business that was going on Backpage. Let's stay a little bit kind of in that 2018 timeframe, because there were some interesting developments. You certainly mentioned that the website through a joint investigation was seized and taken down. That was in April of 2018. There also was a new law that was passed in 2018. And we'll go back to the Communications Decency Act, a law that was sort of a constant impediment to holding websites like Backpage.com responsible for what was going on those sites. There was a law that was passed that was called FOSTA-SESTA, and it really tried to address some of the particular issues that you'd experienced early on in your prosecution, and that many of the private attorneys were experiencing as well in their attempts to hold Backpage liable liable for the harm and for facilitating the trafficking of their clients. Could you go over a little bit what FOSTA-SESTA did and how it tweaked some of these sex trafficking laws that we've talked about?
Sure. So SESTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, was passed and signed into law, I think in, April of 2018. What it did is it created a specific exemption to the immunity provided by the Communications Decency Act for crimes which come under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So in other words, if there are charges that fall under the federal sex trafficking statute, even if they're charged by a state, or alleged in civil court by a survivor and his or her attorney, the Communications Decency Act will not be a shield. Now, the prosecutor, the plaintiff still must show that the defendants knowingly facilitated, that the defendants either were engaged in a joint enterprise to traffic, and it can't just be, this isn't about, a passive website that has no idea what's going on. The website, actually, defendants, the people that run the website, actually have to have knowledge and specific intent in order to be held liable.
And what impact do you think that new law has had? I know it's only been a couple of years, but what have you seen in the field?
I think it still takes time to shake out, to interpret that, it's a major change though. It really is a significant change. And there's already close to a dozen cases that are pending in various courts across the country where this new law is being tested, and defendants are trying to use the Communications Decency Act, and plaintiffs are arguing, nope, you don't get the Communications Decency Act. This is a sex trafficking case. So I think it's a good tool. I think it's also kind of pushed online companies to do more to prevent sex trafficking on their sites. I think it's caused companies to, have entire, human rights departments, hopefully investing in more analytics software to prevent the use of their sites, for minors and for sexual purposes, to be quicker about rooting that out when it happens. I still think we have a long ways to go. But I do think it's moved us in the right direction.
That's great. So Maggie, we're getting some great questions in the Q&A. So before we switch over to the questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you one more question. I know you and I are very conscious that we're having this discussion in January, which is Human Trafficking Month. And over the past, I would say, year or two, we've seen some very public prosecutions involving child sexual abuse and sex trafficking, ranging from the recent verdicts in the Ghislaine Maxwell case, the NXIVM case, Harvey Weinstein and Larry Nassar cases. As a society, do you think we're reaching some sort of inflection point in how we address sex trafficking and other sexual crimes?
That's a great question and a great point. I don't know if I would call it like an inflection point, but I do think we are gradually becoming less and less tolerant of, kind of this rape culture that's been prevalent in the past. I mean, for me, shutting down Backpage was about, was about shutting down something that normalized the sexual abuse of vulnerable teenagers. I remember just hearing again and again, people say, well, if this is so bad, then why is it fine? Why is this easier than ordering a pizza? If there's really something wrong with it. And so that normalization was really, part of the problem. And I think what we're seeing as more and more survivors come forward, and then the legal system kind of vindicates them. We stop saying it's normal, and we start saying this is unacceptable. This isn't okay. If you do this, you will be prosecuted. There are serious consequences. And if you're a survivor and you come forward, we'll stand with you. And I think that is really significant. I think those cases, certainly being high profile contributed to that, to our increased awareness about it.
I would agree. I think the biggest takeaway from many of those cases, not only the fact that there were actual verdicts of guilty in those cases, but just the pure public awareness that this is a problem on a wide scale, that it happens to a range of different victims, all around the world.
I would just say, so I think sort of parallel to this legal landscape evolving that we've talked about, and I would add into the evolving legal landscape laws that allow victims with older cases to come forward, so late reporting statutes. So along with the legal landscape shifting, we have this cultural shift. And I think, those things together are really, what's leading us in the right direction. And I just, I know we're going to go into questions from the audience soon, but I wanted to ask you also, as someone who, kind of sees all these websites and has a really good sense of the lay of the land from the front lines of, identifying and hopefully rescuing missing children who are exploited online. What did the shutdown of Backpage do for the landscape? How is it different without Backpage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, when we go back to that week in April 2018, we really had two things that happened almost simultaneously, I think 3 or 4 days apart. We had the takedown and the shutdown of Backpage.com. And then a few days later, we had the enactment of FOSTA-SESTA. So I think for us at NCMEC, those two are kind of inextricably connected in many ways. But what we definitely saw was really a massive disruption of child sex trafficking online in the immediate aftermath of those events. And I think it's for many of the same reasons that you went over. I mean, obviously, the shutdown in and of itself of Backpage, created a huge void in that marketplace, which Backpage had really filled as the primary actor. And curiously, there was not really a number two in that market. There was not a close parallel type of website that could easily move in and capture that market. And that remains a void today. So what we saw was really, the splintering of child sex trafficking onto a really large range of websites. And that had occurred even while Backpage was up, but it's certainly more pronounced now. So there's not really a single place like there was for Backpage pre-2018 where a buyer knows that they can go and look for a child to buy to sexually abuse. So it's more difficult in many ways. And I also agree, with SESTA-FOSTA, we're just starting to see now some of the implications. Definitely, like you said, a dozen, 15 cases, one federal prosecution also that have been brought under that new law. And I think over the next year or two, we're going to start to see both the strength of that law and also where we need to do a little bit more work, perhaps on federal legislation. So let's switch over to a few questions from the audience, and I'll just kind of start at the beginning and see how many we can get through in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first question is, what can we do today to bring more awareness and to combat sex trafficking?
Great question. Thanks for asking that, especially now because it's January, so it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Although for Yiota, I'm sure every month, every day is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and that's how I've felt as well. Being in California, I think our state has done some really good proactive things to raise awareness. One is we have a posting requirement, a notice requirement in certain types of businesses that are likely to interface with human trafficking survivors. So transportation hubs, train stations, bus stations, hospitality industry places, massage establishments. I think that's helpful, and it has the national hotline. So survivors can call anonymously, advocates can call, members of the public can call, and the line directs them to either victim services locally or law enforcement resources. I think that has helped with awareness. Also training, just understanding how to identify, and then, more importantly, what to do. So, this is, states across the country are in various phases of implementing trainings. There's education trainings, prevention. I work with 3 Strands Global Foundation, which is active in California, Utah, Texas, Michigan, probably a handful of other places, but essentially it's a curriculum for students to understand the dangers of human trafficking and hopefully, protect themselves and each other, from predators. And it's a program that trains teachers to look out for their students. So I think, and obviously law enforcement is at the heart of this. And for law enforcement, the training is essential, but also, healthcare workers, teachers, those in the child welfare system, those in transportation. Truckers Against Trafficking is another great organization, where truck drivers are actually also looking out for this. So I think training is a really good tool to build awareness, as well as the posting requirement, as well as just other community opportunities where, there's volunteer work and ways to support survivors.
And if it's okay, Maggie, I'm just going to mention also that we have a really tremendous child sex trafficking team at the National Center. A lot of their services are analytical services that they provide directly to law enforcement, but they also provide tremendous recovery support services for child welfare, foster parents, law enforcement, victim advocates, so that when children are recovered, there is a victim-centered and an appropriate recovery system that is really designed to make sure those children receive the recovery services that they need. And we also do offer prevention and training outreach, not only to law enforcement, but also to all sorts of child serving professionals. I think it was a really good point you made about healthcare professionals, educational system, really anywhere where children interact is where we need to get training and awareness to. I'll go into the next question. Really good one here. Are there outfits like Backpage still around in other countries like Canada and the UK, Mexico? I'm just going to add, and also in the US for you to answer.
Yeah, I am not as familiar with the international networks, although I can say that Backpage was very active, in Mexico and in several other countries. But yes, it's my understanding that there are websites where children and vulnerable adults are trafficked for sex, and that those websites operate both in the United States and in other countries as well.
Great. So what was your greatest personal challenge during the case?
Personal challenge during the case. Really, having sunk, so much work into the case and having it be dismissed, and then just having to figure out how to get back up, and file a case and going forward. That was a really big challenge for me, but obviously no regrets.
Absolutely. So the next question is, what were the criminal charges actually brought against the senior level members of Backpage? And why did you choose to bring criminal charges instead of civil charges?
It's a good question. So this is going to be a little bit confusing because there's a few different cases going on in different jurisdictions, but ultimately the charges that we prevailed on against Carl Fair that he pled guilty to in California were conspiracy to commit money laundering and then some substantive counts of money laundering. The federal case is still pending, and he pled guilty in the federal case too. The federal case is still pending. I think it's an 100 count indictment, but it's multiple charges of different types of money laundering, facilitation, conspiracy. I think that's the crux of it. in the Texas case, and again, state law is kind of different from state to state. In the Texas case, I believe Carl pled guilty and also pled guilty on behalf of Backpage to human trafficking.
Okay. The next question, is the Epstein Prince Andrew case indicative of similar ongoing crimes for the wealthy? And then this audience member added, thanks for your amazing dedication to this cause, Maggie.
Oh, thank you. I think it was good to see a guilty verdict in the Maxwell case, because to me that said that, being really wealthy doesn't mean you can get away with buying and selling teenagers for sex. I think Backpage is another example where, we were going after some pretty well-heeled defendants. I think, what you read about the criminal justice system and wealthy people having some advantages. I think that's definitely true. But what we've seen with these recent high-profile cases is that, even a lot of money doesn't mean you can get away with this.
Great. So this is a good question from a slightly different perspective. What policies need to be introduced or strengthened to ensure law enforcement has the resources to address this issue?
That's a great question. I think, as a law enforcement person, with most of my career spent as a prosecutor, I think we get the part about holding offenders accountable and continuing to build cases. And certainly the focus of my book is how to build cases systematically and really go after traffickers at the top. I think we really need more investment in services for victims and prevention. And that means, especially just investing in at-risk youth and, underserved communities, because we know, and this is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation about, some people being more susceptible, more vulnerable to this crime. And, since we know at the front end what those factors are, I think, the more we can do to invest in, people who are most at risk, the more we can prevent this at the front end.
And Maggie, I know there's a lot of invested individuals in the audience today. How can an average member of the public really help support, like you said, some of the measures that would benefit law enforcement or others at the state and federal level? What would you recommend?
I would say, the good thing is that almost every community has a nonprofit organization working locally in anti-human trafficking efforts. And I would say, going through the organization in your neighborhood, in your community, and, it might be volunteering to bring, kits for people who are out there. It might be volunteering to put up posters like what I was describing with the California law. It might be, if you have some special skill, if you're an attorney, for example, providing legal services. So there's a number of ways that you can volunteer to help support victims. And that also, supports law enforcement, because law enforcement really needs to, it helps law enforcement to focus on apprehending the predators, when the community can rise up and help support the survivors.
That's great. And I think very helpful for people to hear. So we have we have 3 more questions, so I think we'll be able to get through everything. So the next one is definitely a comment and in a question. The comment is, as a parent of a survivor, I would like to thank you for all your hard work. You truly gave us hope. And the question is, what are your thoughts when politicians talk about decriminalizing and changing legal standards?
That's a really good question. And thanks for your feedback. I have to say, right when we shut the site down and over the last couple months as we ramped up on this book, I've gotten a lot of messages from people saying, I was sold on that site. I'm so glad it shut down. Thank you. And that really means the world to me. That is what it's all about. That's why we did that. And so we're glad that in some cases people are able to move forward and that no one else will be sold on that despicable site. We're talking a lot about decriminalization in California as well. And the problem with it, in my mind, is it just doesn't really leave people with exit strategies. There's a mix of people out there, and sure, it's there are some people who are consenting adults, but for everyone else that's not, it's really, really problematic to say, hey, law enforcement, keep driving. We're not going to do anything about this. We really need to get into a position where we are offering exit strategies and off-ramps and support and healthcare and mental health care and all the things that somebody would need to get out of sex trafficking, before we even think about decriminalizing it and walking away from it. Because right now, it's still just, a really, really devastating crime. That's, like I've been saying, just preying on some really vulnerable kids. I mean, in the Backpage case that we looked at, I remember a victim who was 12 years old. Many of the victims were 15, 16 years old. Most of them had been sexually abused in their own homes. So it's just a really lopsided power dynamic when they get out there on the street and they're being, completely manipulated and abused. So to tell law enforcement, hey, we're not going to criminalize prostitution anymore, just walk away from those situations. It just doesn't comport with the reality of what's going on.
Thank you for that, Maggie. So the next question, also on a slightly different topic. Ray, FOSTA-SESTA, could you speak to the federal City X Guide takedown and whether you see that becoming a precedent?
Sure. So City X Guide was another website. I mean, it was similar to Backpage, although it was a much smaller scope. And it was taken down and prosecuted, let's say maybe a year or two ago. I don't remember the exact time because this whole COVID thing has really thrown off my sense of time. But yeah, that was a really important takedown. And I think it just signifies to any other sites that are out there or want to be out there that law enforcement now has a playbook for shutting this down and holding people accountable.
Are you aware of other criminal prosecutions that have proceeded to date under FOSTA-SESTA?
And that seems like a good question to throw back at you.
So I think City X Guide is the only one that has, really moved forward and gone to a guilty plea and is in the process of being wrapped up now. I think your experience having built a criminal case against Backpage, but let's just say more generically against a sex trafficking website, would probably be really informative for members of the audience who might wonder why there haven't been more cases. And I know you referred to it earlier, but if you could maybe explain a little bit about the amount of resources and time that it takes, not only from a legal perspective to build a case like this, but also the complexities at times and the actual just time that you need to work with survivors to ensure that it's the right time to proceed with the case.
It's a good point. I mean, these are really challenging cases, even with, FOSTA-SESTA and, a big lift on the Communications Decency Act. These are still really hard cases. I mean, the first thing about a website is you have to try and figure out who's operating it, and you have to figure out who they are and where they are. And by the time you do that, they might be somewhere else or have sold it to someone else. So there's that kind of game of whack-a-mole. And then it can just take a lot of investigative resources. You have to be able to connect that person to show that they have knowledge. You have to build up probable cause to get search warrants, probably for that person's emails. And then you have to figure out where the emails are being stored, where the server is even in the United States. And then on top of that, if assuming that it's a sex trafficking case, you need to find survivors who, are willing to cooperate, who have been sold on that site. So putting that all together, in a finite timeline and into a case that's prosecutable is pretty challenging, but it's really important.
Thank you for that explanation. So the next question is also a little bit of a pivot, a great additional follow-up. The question is, what are the backgrounds of the women involved, especially the young girls, and what would you say can be done to make women less prone to succumb to procurers who pose as friends or lovers or partners?
This is a really great question. I appreciated it. What I was talking about before in terms of vulnerability factors and what we see, kids who have been abused or sexually abused at home, kids who are in the foster care system, kids who have been failed by the child welfare system, kids who are running away from home are particularly vulnerable What we can do is more training in those areas, helping these kids understand their worth, their value, that they should stand up for themselves, that they shouldn't be commodified. And then, doing that through school so that they have a safe place. I mean, I think with COVID, many kids were out of school. It made it more difficult for teachers to reach students. But as kids are continuing to be back in the classroom, making sure that teachers are trained, and ready to step in these situations is really important. And then just, making sure kids have the tools they need to protect themselves. I would say to parents, and I understand this vulnerability. I have 2 teenagers myself, and I'm sure anyone who's a parent is kind of cringing throughout this whole book talk. But it's really important to know what your kids are doing online, who they're communicating with, what apps they have, to talk to them about healthy relationships, to make sure they understand that, even if they don't want to talk to you, make sure that they have a trusted adult that they can talk to, and just really instilling in them, some healthy boundaries about relationships.
I'll just add a little bit on there as well, Maggie, if that's okay. I think your points about, parents understanding what their children are doing online, and that there is a trusted adult, which may or may not be a parent, which may be another adult in a child's life, are really crucial recommendations for parents and reminders. And Brittany, I know Brittany's been kind enough to put the National Center's website in the chat a few times. We do have a lot of training materials and outreach materials that are geared specifically towards parents and specifically towards helping parents, again, navigate those discussions and frankly, just navigate understanding what the apps are that kids are on these days, how to talk about those apps with their children, and really how to be more in tune with some of those issues. Maggie, is there anything that didn't get asked that you would like to add about the book or about your amazing experiences today?
I think we covered it. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your work, Yiota. You've really been on the front lines of this. And I'm so glad, we got to work together on all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been just a fascinating 6 or 7 years, seeing not only how your case develops, but everything else that we know has happened around Backpage and SESTA, FOSTA, et cetera. So Brittany, I think we need to turn it back over to you now. So there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to both of you for taking your time out on a Sunday evening to talk about this really important topic. And thank you to all of you for watching, especially for joining us on a weekend. We've already gotten some extra orders in. So remember, if you want to purchase a copy of the book, you also get Maggie's signature with that. And I've dropped the link in the chat a couple times for Politics and Prose's link. And then, like Yiota said, I put links in the chat for the NCMEC as well. So be sure to check that out. But thank you guys again, and everyone stay warm.